Welcome to Indianomics. The Karnataka election confirms that three kinds of poll promises are going to flow freely in the coming state elections and even in the national election next year. One, a basic income for every household, call it for women or call it Kisan Samman Nidhi. Second, free power. And three, free grains. But the question we are asking today is, can state finances absorb such huge expenses? Actually, last year, state fiscal deficits only stood at 2.6% of GDP, and most states didn't reach the 3% limit that was allowed to them by the center. But this doesn't take into account, of course, unpaid dues to power discoms. Another surprising facet that we need to remember when we discuss fiscal federalism is, when it comes to debt and deficit, the center appears to be the bigger culprit. Here are some data from a government debt status paper on debt published by the DEA last year. It shows that central government's accumulated debt is 59.2% of GDP as of FY21, while the aggregate of all state government debt is less than half of that, 28.6% of GDP. Again, nearly 42% of the centre's revenue receipts goes to pay interest on past dues, whereas interest accounts for only 14% of state government's revenue receipts as of FY21. So clearly, central government more than states is guilty of living or promising beyond its means, or so it seems. Does it get far worse with the forthcoming election cycle? What can be the consequences for the financial sector and for the economy, and how can it be arrested if it indeed can be? I have with me economist Rathin, the Managing Director of Overseas Development Institute, Lekha Chakraborty, professor at NIPFP, and a person I consider most important here, AN Jha. He was member of the 14th Finance Commission, a former IAS officer. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Rathin, to start with you, there are, for the state governments, some constitutional limits. They can't go over 3% of their of GDP as fiscal deficit. If they have to borrow from the market, they have to take the central government's permission. So need we worry?
No, you're right. They will have to take the central government's permission, and there is no, therefore, sort of prudential need to worry about state government debt escalating beyond a point. They will need to find the resources to do so, either by raising revenues or by allowing inflation to raise their revenues. And the sums, for example, in Karnataka being bandied about 40,000 crores,
yes,
that is eminently achievable as long as the state government can do it. As Keynes once said, if you can do it, you can afford it. The question is, can you do it?
Okay, it's interesting that you say Keynes, because when I spoke to Professor Rajiv Gowda of the Congress, he also quoted Keynes, saying that if we were to spend so much money, the Keynesian logic will mean there will be more development and more state revenues. Mr. Jha, your take. This is becoming an epidemic now. It looks like this is a copy-paste. We are going to see free power, free grains, and some basic income, either for women or for farmers, getting promised. After all, the central government set the model with the Kisan Samman Nidhi. Others are only copying. You think that we should worry about state finances, or as Rathin says, there are controls?
Well, I agree with Rathin that there is a fiscal cap on the borrowing that states undertake, and rightly so, that will limit the extent of debt which they can raise. But what we have observed in the Finance Commission was the rising debt of the states even before COVID. About 20 to 25% was considered of debt. GSDP ratio was considered to be optimal. Both 13th and 14th Finance Commissions had worked around that level. Karnataka, for instance, did much better than that. But now what we have observed is that the debt levels of even a state like Karnataka, which has been the flag bearer of fiscal responsibility over the last 2 decades or so, has been stretched, and their interest liabilities have gone up. What is worrying at the state level is that if this type of subsidies or freebies or whatever name you give to them become the template as we go into the future. The capital expenditure which the states undertake, they undertake almost more than 60% of the capital expenditure that takes place in the country as a whole. That is likely to suffer, and that will have long-term consequences. Apart from creating liabilities on interest account, which increased borrowings will definitely lead to, because they are at 2.6% now, they can go up to 3.5% as the Finance Commission has prescribed, 3%
Yes.
and 4.5% for power subsidies. So this is going to be a challenge. Another cause of concern which I thought I should flag here was the high cost of committed expenditure of states. Now, out of 28 states, 28 states now, only 11 have the committed expenditure to own revenue receipts ratio of less than 100. Out of this, only 3 are below 50, that is Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Goa. Rest are all at a point where their own revenue receipts are able to barely cover their committed expenditure.
Okay.
So what I feel is that as we go forward, this type of indulgence, or as we say, the fiscal, forbearance,
Adventurism. Okay.
adventurism, you
Yeah.
say, is going to have consequences which we witnessed, especially in the late 90s when the fiscal position of the states had become very, very bad.
CapEx and other important expenditure, infrastructure expenditure, and secondly, will they even be able to pay salaries? It is reaching a state in some places where committed expenditure itself is not getting covered by their own revenue. Okay, that's two dangers you point out. Lekha, before I get to the next, I wanted to speak about this impact on not enough capital expenditure. But would you worry about fiscal finances of the states? I thought there are some constitutional guardrails, but of course the discoms escape that off balance sheet. Any other dangers you would point out, or do you think state finances are guarded because the constitution has put those rules?
To me, the fiscal policy needs to be very accommodative at this point, and I don't find any fault with Congress if they are floating the agenda to focus on social infrastructure instead of physical infrastructure. Because our narrative so far is we can keep the fiscal policy accommodative, but it has to be tied to the physical infrastructure. But it is taking time to, translate into the robust economic growth. So in that context, when there is widening inequalities, if Congress is putting importance to the social infrastructure, that's welcome. Because we need to focus on the widening inequalities, and of course we need to focus on the intersectionalities, because Karnataka is not just Bangalore, and within the state, there are widening inequalities, and the poor voted for Congress means there is a concern for widening inequalities, and we need to address that. Now, tying it to the fiscal space, how we can do that, whether we need to engage into the participation income by providing people enough jobs, or we need to give them the basic cash transfers. This, narrative, the government needs to pitch in, whether we need to give basic, transfers, or we need to focus on creating more employment and guarantee that the people will participate in the economy and earn an income. So that narrative needs to be taken. But overall, the fiscal policy needs to be accommodative, and the state is doing well. The robust growth path, that's very important. To keep the state in the robust growth path, maybe they can work with the debt maturity structure. If they can, postpone the refinancing risk by floating more of long-term instead of the short-term bonds, that will be, guarding the state.
Actually, that brings a very new and fresh perspective to the table, that social infrastructure was crying out for some help simply because in the post-COVID or even pre-COVID years, distribution has become extremely skewed, and therefore some basic support had to be given. Rathin, how would you square the two? Clearly, there's something is lost in terms of not being able to provide roads, perhaps, or other physical infrastructure, but social infrastructure is needed. And after all, let's remember, midday meals, when it started off in Tamil Nadu, everybody and their uncle went against it, and then the central government adopted it because it was a great way to attract kids to school and even keep them nourished. So, would you support social infrastructure of some point?
I think Lekha has completely nailed it. She's absolutely right. This sort of mindless obsession with capital expenditure, which is neither productive nor ever done on time, versus the need to urgently provide social infrastructure, reflects three things. I'm not a communist, so I expect the private sector to be the prime mover of investment in the economy. If the private sector is not the prime mover of investment in the economy, then government has to step in. And that, in fact, was the argument that the finance minister gave for the government stepping in to ramp up capital expenditure. Otherwise, that is not the core business of government in a modern economy. However, it is the core business of government to take care of things that ail society.
Yeah.
And the two things that this particular, if you take Karnataka as an example, or you take the farmer thing that Modi did, what is wrong? What ails society? What ails society is that farmers cannot earn a decent livelihood or income without government support. That's not a freebie, because farmers need to be supported by government because the economic system has failed them. Monthly pension to widows of 1,500, if widows were affluent and not suffering in an economy that is going Amrit Kal or whatever it is, then you would not have to give women the kind of freebies you give. You give that because there's severe gender inequality. And therefore, women are under stress. So you have to, and it is a legitimate job of government to rectify this. So I have elsewhere talked about this, that the government of India, that the governments of India, increasingly have moved from being what I would call a development state to a compensatory state.
Okay.
But essentially what they're doing is they're compensating people for societal and economic failures. That is the first dimension. The second dimension is very important. The major tax collector in this country is the central government.
Yes.
It is the central government's job to collect taxes. And it has failed spectacularly in that job over the last 15 years. It has even failed to do the plan B, which was to at least disinvest and use those resources to finance. In that situation, what can the states do? The states have to fulfill their obligations. The tax collector of the governments of India is not doing its job. Obviously, there'll be difficult fiscal choices to make. Third point I want to make is in the context of talking about India. Now, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu and states like that are closer to Indonesia in terms of per capita income than to Nepal. And UP and Bihar are poorer than Nepal. Now, states that are therefore richer are not getting the fiscal reward of that richness, quite rightly, because we are one union. And therefore, resources are distributed not according to your affluence, but according to your, relative poverty. But that does not mean that therefore you apply a one-size-fits-all rule anymore to states that are relatively affluent, because if you live in a relatively affluent state, you are entitled to expect slightly better services than the lack of affluence. You cannot penalize states for doing things,
Yes,
that are
I can afford it, so I'm giving the
but you can't afford it because our national laws redistribute it.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that thing has to come into the lens of the next finance commission very, very starkly, because the levels of regional inequality that are rising, combined with sort of dissonance, are creating a situation which I think is the real one.
Okay.
Not freebies and other accounting.
You're hitting the ball straight into Mr. AN Jha's goal. So I guess that question will be picked up. But I also want, you pointed out that the central government's job was to collect taxes and distribute it. And aside from the fact that tax buoyancy hasn't been too good and tax collection hasn't been too efficient, hopefully GST will set it right, the distribution also, I think after putting in the cess, takes away some 28% of gross tax revenues away from what should legitimately have gone to the states. That question and more after the break. We are back in a minute. Are poll promises wrecking government finances? That's the question we have been discussing with economists Lekha Chakraborty of NIPFP, Rathin Roy, Managing Director of the ODI, Overseas Development Institute, and Mr. AN Jha, a member of the 14th Finance Commission. Gentlemen, and Lekha, thank you very much for staying on. Mr. Jha, that question to you which Rathin raised. In the first place, are we pulling up the central government enough? Firstly, the data I pointed out when I started off, outstanding debt to GDP, the centers is double that of the states, whereas the states have all the expenditure items like health, rural development, education, etc. And secondly, proportion of the revenue that is going to pay interest is like 3 times. It's 41%, whereas it is 14% for the states. So perhaps fiscal discipline should start at the center, you think?
Well, yes, center has a higher debt compared to the states, and it is almost what 20% points more than what the states have currently. This has been the situation over the years. It's not something new that has come about because the center has the most important role in the economy, which is of macro stabilization. And for that, there are steps which the center needs to take. You should also remember that center also transfers almost 30% of the resources that it collects by way of transfers to the states, including devolution and grants in aid, which goes to the states. But that apart, this is a fact which has been continuing. The stress on the center is particularly large at the moment because of the impact of COVID and the extra fiscal space which they had to create to meet the requirements of the economy during the last 2 to 3 years. But there is a signal of consolidation, which we shall see in the next 2 years as it unfolds in this 15th Finance Commission award.
Okay.
As far as interest payments are concerned, yes, it is a cause of worry for the center also, because almost 40% plus of the revenues are preempted by interest payment. That's a very high cost to bear for the economy, because then other expenditures which the center can incur, even on union subjects, get affected by that.
Actually,
So it is a challenge which has to be met.
No, your own report, 14th Finance Commission report said that even at that time, you all were looking at 47% of central revenues going to pay interest. And you pointed out that this is not because of defense. This is because you are spending on items which is not their area at all, you know, more like health and others, which they should logically have left to the states and merely devolved the money. Lekha, you know, the point is, do you see a danger to what Mr. Jha pointed out as committed expenses? Yes, where you have the money, like in a rich state, and where you know, you don't have committed expenditure like dues to discoms or salaries, you're fine. But now we will get to elections in Chhattisgarh and Rajasthan, where the old pension scheme is has already been resorted to. Are we going to head into a crisis there, where bills will not be paid? Discom bills, salaries.
Yes, the discretionary fiscal space is very important. I agree with him. And discretionary fiscal space is, you know, what is available devoid of the interest payments commitments that we need to check. And within that, if the state is floating the old pension scheme, then I have a, you know, the issue over there in the sense that when we talk about the welfare models, if you're focusing on the old pension scheme, we are focusing only on 4% of the people who are in the employed sector or in the organized sector, and within that, a minute. But my point, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the social infrastructure, I do agree that there's a case for the state to float more social infrastructure, but of course, not, you know, revoking the old pension scheme. There, you know, as it is not a broad-based, you know, social policy, I do have a concern over there. You know, other than that, you know, floating the discretionary fiscal space, identifying that is very crucial. And when it comes to the fiscal consolidation, if the taxes are not buoyant, you have to go through an expenditure compression. So how do you rationalize that expenditure? How do you, you know,
especially when everything is committed, right?
Yes.
That would be an issue, and that's where we may head into a huge roadblock, at least for states where the committed expenditure is very high.
No, that's why I mentioned earlier that we can do with the financing pattern of the deficit. That if we can postpone the refinancing risk to future
Yeah.
by floating more long-term than short-term bond, if we can have that robust growth path in
Yes.
front of you by cleaning up the maturity structure of the debt market,
Yeah.
then you can maneuver.
Yeah,
That's what the point
absolutely. And
I
we are
flag.
told that we are going to be the fastest economy for the next decade. So perhaps it's going to be paid. Let's push the
We can
problem,
grow
if
out
not
of
to our
it, yeah.
children, to our grandchildren. Okay, that's a different one. Rathin Roy, I'm running out of time, but two very important questions to you. The first one, we have clearly moved in terms of how the state interacts with the economy and the society. In the first few decades, the state provided free education. I studied in state schools, which were very cheap. So first we provided education. Then the state moved away from that and started providing, PDS, MNREGA, which also was, social goods. And now we are coming to a stage where the state is providing basic income, gas cylinders, perceivable public goods, because clearly it appears either it has failed in the education sphere or, these are more tangible poll promises. What is the impact on the economy when the state moves from providing, this widespread social infrastructure to basic goods, toilets, gas cylinders, or just a basic income? Is the impact on the economy very different?
It's an admission of failure, Latha.
Of course.
It's an admission of failure because, and I've said this when people say universal basic income, India is not a developed country. India has to undergo its economic transformation, and that economic transformation, basically, what does it mean not to be poor? It means with your own income, you can go to the market and buy the things that you want.
Yeah.
70 years down the line, that is not happening in substantial measure, especially in the northern and eastern parts of India. And even in states like Karnataka, there's massive intrastate inequality. So then what does the state do? It has to respond to this by compensating people for their failure to go to the market and buy things with the income they earn, be that food, be that clothing. On top of that, there are severe socioeconomic inequalities. There's youth unemployment, there is patriarchy, there's a problem with women's access to markets, and therefore the state has to correct for that as well. So it has moved away from the business of a development transformation to the business of compensating people for the failure to transform development. And if you ask me, is there a plan for development transformation? I see none. What I see is some talk about some $1 trillion economy, something, and Amrit Kaal and fastest growing economy in the world. But what is the plan? Is India going to grow its manufacturing? How is that income going to spill out? What are we going to do about the 100 million youth?
No, I take your point.
unemployed?
Yeah, moving away from that social infrastructure.
These are the fiscal actions you see are a consequence of these economic developments and not the other way.
All right, thank you very much. I'm out of time, but this was an enriching conversation. First, by saying let's not bash up all freebies. Sometimes social infrastructure has to be paid heed to. More importantly, this is because of the failure of the state in several areas of providing protection for women, inequality, unable to correct it, and therefore it has to become a compensatory state, as Rathin Roy says, and as Mr. Jha points out, the centre also has a lot to answer for in terms of the debt it has run up, but the states face a problem because a large part of their revenue is going for committed expenditure. So they may be reneging on their payments. Some of them, of course, not all of them. We have to wrap up on that note. Thank you very much for watching this special edition of Economics.